last session, we're going to have a look and explore a lot of the stuff about building control, the duty holder regime, Building Safety Act, and further changes coming down the road. So, going to have a look at the role of building. A lot of the questions that I've had is about building control, so I will try and dispel some myths in terms of what we do, what we don't do, and what it looks like. Talk a bit about Grenfell and the Building Safety Act, and then the changes to the building regulations that came into force from 1st of October 2023 that created the duty holder regime, which I know a number of people have asked about before, so hopefully we can get clarity on those. And finishing off with the role of building control approvers, registered building inspectors, and what building control is going to look like in the future. So, private building control application. So when you go to OWL or another building control body, so we are a registered building control approver. And what you do is you instruct OWL or another to submit an initial notice under section 47 of the Building Act, which informs the local authority that we are the building control body for that work. And for the period of time that the initial notice is in force, we are the building control body, or private building control, whoever you choose. Now, at the end of that process, we should, all being well, as long as we're satisfied within all professional skill and judgment that the works are in accordance with the building regulations, we receive all the information that we need to, we can issue a final certificate in accordance with section 51 of the Building Act. And that's our role and end. We are no longer the building control body. There is no building control application in force. Now, if we cannot issue the final certificate for whatever reason during the period that the initial notice is in force, then we can cancel the initial notice. And there's 3 reasons why we can cancel the initial notice. Under 52(1)(a) of the Building Act, when we are of the opinion that we can no longer perform our function. Under 52(1)(b) of the Building Act, that works are being performed that we feel like we can no longer perform our function. And 52(1)(c), when we've issued a contravention of the building regulations, what's known as a Reg 21 notice, and that contravention hasn't been resolved within 3 months, basically. So those are the reasons that we can cancel the initial notice, and why we must cancel the initial notice. That is the extent of a private building control body's enforcement action. The only action that we have is to cancel the initial notice, and that enables it to be reverted and to be taken over, in inverted commas, by the local authority building control. Now, one other type of building control to mention is competent person schemes. So they are listed in Schedule 3 and 3A of the building regulations. We've all heard of them. So FENSA, NICEC and similar, PTAS, etc., etc. They are certified by that relevant body to undertake building works as defined under Regulation 3 and issue certificates relating to that work. The scope of their work is purely defined within Schedule 3. So, for example, installation of a heat-producing gas appliance, then this person should be part of the gas safety regulations and gas safe registered. Now, the next type of building control to talk about is applications to a local authority. And as a private building control body, we often hear things like, can we have it like a building notice type application? No such thing exists. It is not a building notice type application that goes to a private building control body. All we can do is submit an initial notice. That is it. Whereas at a local authority, there are 2 types of application: a building notice and a full plans application. Now, in a building notice, people again say it's we haven't got plans or information, etc., etc. It is a specific type of application required under Regulation 13 of the building regulations, and you should provide information to the local authority saying this is a building notice application, and these are the particulars that meet these requirements that you need to provide. Now, if you are not providing a building notice application, then you need to provide a full plans application. However, if it's not a full plans application, unless you meet all of the requirements in paragraph 3. So a set of plans, details of the energy status, all of those provisions need to be provided to the local authority for them to be able to register the application as a full plans application. application itself. Now, I've had a number of conversations during breaks or during presentations about previous works that have taken place that haven't had a building control application. If that's the case, the only method for which you can regularise the work is a regularisation application, which is under Regulation 18 of the building regulations relating to unauthorised building works. A private building control body cannot submit an initial notice where works have formally started, because Section 47 of the Building Act refers to the intention to start work. So you cannot intend to start work if works have already started. And that is why we need to wait before you can start works on site after we submit the initial notice itself. A regularisation certificate, if the works have been carried out after the 11th of November 1985. Now, what happens in those instances is they make an assessment of the works themselves at the time that the works were completed. So it's not relating to works in terms of current standards, it's when the works were completed themselves. And at the end of that, via all professional skill and judgment, they're happy that the works would comply as much as they possibly can be, then they would issue a regularisation certificate. Now, mentioning a little bit about enforcement. So Section 35 and Section 36 of the Building Act, and this was changed from the 1st of October 2023 as well, to extend those time periods that we talked about before. So, it's worthwhile just reading the powers that local authorities do have relating to penalty for contravening the building regulations. Person guilty of an offence under this section is liable on summary conviction to imprisonment for a term not exceeding the maximum summary term for either way offences or a fine or both. On conviction or indictment to imprison for a term not exceeding 2 years or a fine, and in either case is liable to some conviction. Section 35B is a compliance notice which the local authority can issue to those works where they identify a contravention. Building authority may give a compliance notice to a person who appears to the authority to have contravened or likely to contravene a provision of the building regulations themselves. So it's the local authorities who have the powers under Section 35 and Section 36 to take enforcement action. And under Section 36, they can instruct those who are responsible to pull down or remove the work, and, right at the bottom there, may recover from him the expenses necessary reasonably incurred by them in doing so. And this is where I'm talking about the extension of time period from 1st of October 2023. A notice under subsection 1 or 2 above called a Section 36 notice shall not be given after the expiration of, used to be 12 months, 10 years from the date of the completion of work in schedule. So that ability to serve a 36 notice, Section 36 notice, and take enforcement action has been extended significantly. So we talked about private building control, initial notices, fine certificates, cancellations, and we talked about local authorities and their ability to take enforcement action under Section 35 and Section 36. And we talked about competent person schemes. Now, the one other building control body that is in place is the building safety regulator. Now, they are the mandatory building control body for any high-rise residential building, high-risk residential building, which is a building that contains one or more flats, of 7 stories or higher or 18 metres or higher. They are the mandatory building control body, and you cannot choose an alternative. We're not going to talk a huge amount about the BSR as a building control body because the focus is on domestic instances, but it's important you know that if you're ever involved with a HRB, that you cannot choose who your building control body is. It must be the BSR. So, bit of context. It is undoubtedly the changes themselves, although I've been doing this presentation for a little while now, the changes to the regulatory framework, the biggest for over 40 years. I would actually go further than that. I think it's the biggest changes within construction legislation since the Second World War. There is a direct delineation from the Grenfell Tower in 2017 to Dame Judith Hackett's report in 2018, Building a Safer Future, to the Building Safety Act in 2022, and the subsequent amendments to the building regulations and the other regulations that sit around it. I think it's important to note that within Dame Judith Hackett's report in 2018, she criticised the lack of clear roles and responsibilities within the building regulations, which has led directly, without too much supposition, to the creation of the duty holder regime, which we will come to shortly. What is important to understand is that the aim of this legislation, the aim of the changes under the building regulations, is to show that in the event of something going wrong in the future, there is no ability for any party involved to stipulate that they were unaware of their requirements, but if they do say that, that is not a defence, and there is a clear line of responsibility to who took the decision that resulted in the defect, that resulted in the issue. That is the aim of the changes themselves. So, Building Safety Act. I talked a little bit about the Defective Premises Act. It's important to note that on the 1st of January 2022, it's not like the entirety of the Building Safety Act came into force all in one. So there's a number of transitional regulations which are vehicles for enabling changes to other pieces of legislation. So transitional provisions regulations. So 1st of October was a big day. Changes to the building regulations, changes to the RRO, changes to the fire safety in England regulations, which actually removed, under the RRO, previously there was that provision for the number of occupants within the building, whether it was an applicable building. Under section 156 of the Building Act, it now enables that any building which is non-domestic is a relevant building. So it doesn't matter about the number of occupants in terms of the offers. And also changes to the approved inspector regulations, which then became the registered building control approver regulations. Mentioned a little bit about Defective Premises Act. This is still a moving feast. We've had significant court cases, I mentioned one before, where the provisions of the Building Safety Act and their ability to take retrospective action is being strengthened through court cases again and again and again. That's what I would say. It also, via the Building Safety Act, enabled the creation of the Building Safety Regulator, a subsidiary of the HSE, which has a wide-reaching remit. So not only are they the building control body for every single building above 18 metres, they also control, via the request for building assessment certificates, any existing HRB. They are also the auditor of every single building control body up and down the land, local authority and private building control. They are also the register for every single registered building inspector, so every individual building control profession. So massive, massive, massive remit for a relatively new organisation.
How many people do they have?
Well, I mean, that's a potential contentious question. I suppose the numbers that are employed by the BSR is not freely available information. I think it's been widely publicised about the limits of resourcing that they have for gateways applications, and that's led to a hold up in terms of gateways 1, 2 and 3. I think that's widely published. I think where we are at the moment in terms of those applications is the BSR blaming industry for a lack of detail in terms of the provision of information, meaning that they cannot provide approval for gateways 2 and 3, and industry blaming the BSR for a lack of progression and timescales, which they link to a lack of resources, people working for the BSR. That's kind of where we are at the moment. So, if you'll just humour me for a second, I won't ask you to raise your hands, but just bear this question in mind, because a lot of the questions that we've had relate to this, whether a building control fire certificate proves compliance to the building regulations. Bear that in mind as we go through the next elements. So, building regulations. We talked obviously in the first session about building regulations, Regulation 2, all the rest of it, Regulation 3, requirements, Regulation 4. So, the amendments to the building regulations from the 1st of October 2023 created Part 2A of the building regulations themselves. So when I did this originally, those transitional provisions were still in place, but we're well past those now. So any application that you put in place to a building control body, local authority or private, are subject to Part 2A of the building regulations. As a caveat, any application you put into the BSR is subject to a whole suite of other secondary legislation, which I have no knowledge of whatsoever, because it's purely the BSR that are the building control body. They are subject to lots of other additional requirements. This is for non-HRB work. and bearing in mind that we're trying to focus on domestic dwellings. It's important to note that these are procedural changes. They're not technical changes regarding introduction of Part S or O that we've talked about before. These are procedural changes which bring in a number of elements and terminology and processes. So, within definitions, so Regulation 2, I've extracted some of the key terminology which relates to Part 2A of the building regulations. And many of the questions that you guys have in terms of the built environment, I think the answers can be found in the definition sections. And I'll read a couple of them. So business means a trade, business, or other undertaking, whether for profit or not. Doesn't make any reference to a relevant business or a construction business or property business. It just says business means a trade, business, or other undertaking, whether for profit or not. A client means any person for whom a project is carried out. Contractor means any person, including a client, but not a domestic client, who in the course of a business carries out, manages, or controls any building work. Design work means the design of any building work. Designer means any person who in the course of a business carries out design work, or arranges for or instructs any person under their control to do so. So quite a few of the questions is about whether I am a designer and therefore by default whether you're a principal designer. If you are designing for the purposes of building work, as defined where we talked about under Regulation 3, you are a designer. If you're asking somebody else who's under your control to conduct design work, you are a designer. That's what the legislation says. And it doesn't mean you've produced drawings or calculations or anything on those lines. That clearly is design work. But a contractor stipulating that a type of insulation should be installed is design work. Informal guidance that you've put in place or suggested over a phone, that is design work. It does not relate to drawings that you've produced. It is everything relating to building work. A domestic client means a client for whom a project is being carried out which is not in the course or furtherance of a business of that client. Principal contractor means appointed under Regulation 11D, and the same with principal designer. There you go. So, a couple of bits just to mention. A domestic client means a client for whom a project is being carried out which is not in the course or furtherance of a business of that client. It's important to note that if it's not in the course of a furtherance of a business of that client, then therefore, try again, I'll do this in a minute. So, it's important to note that design work means design of any building work, carries out or instructs a person to do so. Where am I going with this? Right, contractor, sorry, I'll get there in the end. Contractor means any person, including client, but not a domestic client, who in the course of a business carries out, manages, or controls any work. So it's important to note that a domestic client cannot be a principal contractor, because a contractor is somebody that's listed under Regulation 11D, and therefore a domestic client, a contractor, but not a domestic client, therefore they cannot be a principal contractor. This is the way legislation is written, I'm afraid. But that's the knob of it. It's also clear that a domestic client cannot be a principal designer, because if you're not carrying out the furtherance of business of that client, designer is somebody who's carrying out in the course of a business. So it's not in the course of a business. Principal designer in the course of a business. The two are not interrelated. Therefore, a domestic client cannot be principal designer, and they cannot be principal contractor. I know I haven't explained that particularly well, but just take my word for it, trust me.
Is there any difference between principal design and sole design?
Sorry, say that again.
Is there any difference between principal design and sole design?
Yes, and it depends on whether you're working for a client or a domestic client. So I'll come to that now. Is that okay? So within the regulations themselves, 11C relates to domestic client. And it's important to note that, rightly or wrongly, I think probably rightly, that the government, when they wrote this legislation, assumed that a domestic client did not have the necessary competence to be able to undertake the overarching role of a client. So if you read 11A1 on the right-hand side there, a client must make suitable arrangements for planning, managing, monitoring the project, including allocation of sufficient time and other resources to ensure compliance with all relevant requirements. So the overarching responsibility for a client, not a domestic client, lies with the client itself. They must make suitable arrangements to ensure compliance. Whereas for a domestic client, The overarching requirements where the client is a domestic client, the duties in Regulation 11A1 to 3 and 11E2 to 5 must be carried out where there's only one contractor for a project, the contractor, and where there's more than one contractor for a project, the principal contractor. So, numerous conversations that I've had, it's important to note that the principal contractor for a domestic client has overall responsibility to make suitable arrangements for planning, managing and monitoring the project, including allocation of sufficient time and other resources to ensure compliance with all relevant requirements. Principal contractors are accruing a huge amount of responsibility under this legislation itself. Going back to your point over there, if a domestic client fails to make the appointments required by Regulation 11D, PD and PC, the designer in control of the design phase of the project is the principal designer, and the contractor in control of the construction phase of the project is the principal contractor. So by default, if you are in control of those phases of the project, you are PD, you are PC. So if you're a sole designer, you are the only designer, you are in control of a design, and therefore you are principal designer.
What happens for self-build?
It's a brilliant question. So I think we need to go back to interpretations. So going back to what a domestic client is. Business means a trade business or other undertaking, whether for profit or not, if it's not in the furtherance of a business of that client. So the question is a self-builder in the furtherance of a business of that client? Because if they are a client and not a domestic client. If they're not, they're a domestic client, and therefore all of the other things come into force. And if they're a domestic client, they cannot be principal contractor and they cannot be principal designer. So a self-builder needs to make the judgment, and whoever's working and making the decisions on the project itself needs to make the judgment whether they're carrying out the works, the project, for a trade, business or other undertaking, whether for profit or not. Doesn't make reference to whether it's biscuits or cookies, or that business can be anything, but is it for a business?
Well, if they're going to be the owner-occupier, then you would think not.
I think in some instances that I've come across, they've stipulated that they are operating for the purposes of business, and therefore they are a client rather than a domestic client. But I agree with you, in the vast majority of cases, they would be a domestic client, and therefore they cannot act as principal contractor or principal designer.
Who becomes the principal contractor then on a self-build where every element is given to a separate contract?
It's another brilliant question. So it's worthwhile mentioning that the government, when they wrote this legislation, didn't give us examples of what happens in each and every circumstance. So what we need to do as building control bodies and professionals within the built environment is read the legislation and come to our best judgment on what we're doing. So I would say, I think it's clear that a domestic client cannot be principal contractor. Therefore, somebody else must be operating as principal contractor, and if they're control of the construction phase of the project, they're doing it by default, even if they're not aware of it. Now, we'll talk about in a minute about what happens when one principal contractor moves on to another, because there's actually a formal process that should take place, a transfer and similar. That's what should happen. But the importance is that at the end of the project, whoever has been listed as the principal contractor, or indeed anyone that's taken on the role, even by default of PD or PC, must issue a compliance declaration at the end of the project. Now, it's important to note that it says that in control of the construction phase of the project. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're the person digging the foundations or putting the DPC in or building the walls or whatever. So you could be a project manager, you could be a QS, could be anything. But I think it's important, and what we try to do within our organisation is have these difficult conversations early on. Who is going to be your PD? Who is going to be your PC? You're going to need to sign a compliance declaration at the end.
So if you're a domestic client, you do all the work yourself.
Yep.
You're not allowed to be the principal designer or the principal contractor.
Yep.
So you haven't got a PD or PC.
You're going to need to allocate one. So depending on
if you're doing all the work yourself,
what works hypothetically we're looking at.
Well, let's say I have friends that do build their own houses.
Yep.
Right? And they do all of it themselves.
Yeah.
So where does that person lie in this?
So again, it's important to note the government haven't given us specific examples. They've written the legislation and they told us to figure it out. So I think it's important to note that we go, domestic clients cannot be PD or PC. You can define yourself as a client if you're operating for the purposes of business. You should make that judgment and record accordingly and tell us that that's what you're doing. If you are operating as a client, you can be PD and PC. If you are not, you're DC, and you can't be principal designer and principal contractor. If you are a domestic client, then you should seek somebody else to be principal designer and principal contractor who will then sign the compliance declarations at the end of the project.
So if you're building your own extension, so if someone's building their own extension, doing all the work themselves, they still must go and get a competent person as PD or PC, whichever.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes?
If you're a designer and you've asked them to appoint a different principal designer instead of you, and they don't appoint anyone, does that make you by default the designer, even if you refuse to do it?
Yes, if it's for a domestic client. If you're in control of the design phase of the project, then you are the principal designer by default. Yes?
For example, domestic clients have a contractor and we design a steel beam for them to remove the wall.
Yep.
The client also asks the contractor to redo the wiring of the sockets and add a bit of things around them due to tighter building control. Why would we be automatically assigned principal designer if it's not a phase of work that we control or involved with?
I'll come to the next stage in relating to duties and roles of principal designers shortly, but it's worthwhile noting that is very, very clear. 11C2, designer in control of the design phase of the project, is the principal designer. Now I see numerous instances, I'm sure we all do, within the built environment they say, I'm not going to be PD, I've told them I'm not going to be PD, etc., etc., etc. You can sign any caveats that you want. The legislation is clear. 11C2, if you're in control of the design phase, you are the PD.
Well, on the client, it says they have to allow adequate resources. So if they're refusing to pay you a fee,
Correct.
to be the principal designer,
Then the
they're
client-
not performing their role.
Correct.
And then,
Correct.
where do you stand?
So you've hit the nail on the head. Client has responsibilities as well to allocate sufficient time and resources. So I have conversations with architects about this all the time, as Duncan will allude to. If you've gone to a client and you've said, for me to be principal designer, it's going to be X amount, I'm going to need to do this amount, and they say no, then you need to be honest with them and say, well, I can't act as principal designer, I'm resigning from my post. That's it. Simple as. I think most of this legislation that's put in place here is about having difficult conversations which before we've been reticent to have because we're all English and we don't want to have difficult conversations. I think this is about detailing and being open and honest with the client that yes, you need to allocate sufficient time and resources for the project itself, whether you're a project manager, a QS, or whoever's taking on that role.
But the problem we've got is if I do structural engineering and there's an architect involved,
Yeah.
and the architect only done planning drawings, right? And we, here do the structure for this. So we're not doing the insulation, we're not doing the drainage, we can't do it for those price. We're not in control of any of that. We're just doing structure alone, right? But we're the only professional on the job, right?
Yeah.
So by default, I become the principal designer, but only for the work that I produce.
Yeah, so that's a really
So
good
there's the default.
Yeah, that's really important example. I'll just run with that if you don't mind, just for a second. So say you're the structural engineer appointed. You are appointed on the 1st of February, and you do the structural engineer's design. You finished, and you issue it on the 1st of March. Right? What I would highly recommend is that you inform everybody that you have completed your design stage when you were principal designer, and you've issued your notice to the client and to the person who's going to be becoming the PD that you are no longer PD. Now, the contractor could then take on the principal designer role, and again, going back to the point of what design is, if he is designing, even if it's just going out purchasing insulation or looking on the website or whatever it is, then he is undertaking design work. So it's the person who is in control of the design phase of the project.
So once the principal contractors, they're just working off the planning drawings, and they do everything else as they go along without any architecture or other input. they become the principal designer.
Well, by default, it's the person who's in control of the design phase of the project. And I think it's really important, protect yourself, I'll come to this next slide, protect yourselves as professionals within the built environment by confirming to everybody involved that you were the principal designer. I will issue the compliance declaration for that 1 month that I was principal designer, but I am resigning from my post because I'm no longer in control of the design phase of the project.
This is where the problem lies, because the building control will not accept your resignation. You're the principal designer, all of a sudden, you know, a year later, right, which has no input anything on site, you know, and all of a sudden you get the certificate to come in and say, can you sign this please?
So I'll come to exactly, again, there's an interesting point about building control. So let's talk about what you are signing when you sign that compliance declaration or you don't. So, principal designer. Some of the questions that you're alluding to were answered by this point. So I've split these. I would recommend go away and read the legislation. It is dry, but it impacts everybody. Part 2A is literally 10 pages. Read it. But I have highlighted some of the key components here. So overall, principal designers have a responsibility to plan, manage and monitor to ensure compliance with all relevant requirements and take all reasonable steps, which includes, you know, people that are designing other elements. You should take all reasonable steps to incorporate that design to make sure the final design, which you're designing, complies with all relevant requirements. You know, using the example, architect in charge, PD, engineer designs something. You should look at that engineer's design and make an assessment about whether it meets the functional requirements of the building regulations. That's it. You know, you don't, architects aren't structural engineers. They're not expected to be able to calculate Young's modulus or deflections or all these sorts of things, but they should be able to look at a design and go, is there an issue with part L? Is there an issue with part C? Does it still comply? So designer in control of the design phase of the project for a domestic client is the principal designer. For a client, I know we talked a lot about domestic clients, for a client, appointments must be made under regulation 11D. So if we're talking about a house builder or commercial client or whatever, then they must make a formal appointment under regulation 11D. The appointment must be made before the construction phase begins, which makes sense because, at least for a domestic client, if you're digging a hole, even if there is no design formally on paper, that is a design that's taken place by the builder to decide to stop digging it at 1 metre. That is a design. And therefore, he's taken on that design decision. Therefore, he's PD, if nobody else is. And if he's starting building works in charge of the construction phase of the project, he is also principal contractor. The only interaction there is with CDM, because they use the same terminology for their wisdom, the only interaction there is with CDM is that if you're doing PD for CDM, you can certify in writing that PD is both CDM and for building regulations. There is no interaction between the CDM and building regulations, principal designer, principal contractor, etc., etc. If the principal designer is not an individual, the designer must designate an individual to complete the functions as PD. So if you're part of a massive architectural practice, one architect needs to be listed as the principal designer. Go back to that point, delineation of responsibility. Competence, I haven't really mentioned it thus far, but it runs throughout the entirety of the Building Safety Act and the building regulations themselves. You cannot act as principal designer if you're not competent to do so. What does competent look like? Skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. And if you stop being competent, you must resign your post as principal designer. Simple as. Duties. So the person carrying out the design work must cooperate with the client, PD and PC, to ensure that the design is such that if the building work to which the design relates were built in accordance with that design, it would be in compliance with all relevant requirements. What does that mean? It's legal speak to say you need to interact with everybody when you are PD to ensure that the works will comply. Take reasonable steps. Really important one, which I think is missed, going back to that point about clients and domestic clients. A designer must not start design work unless satisfied that the client is aware of the duties owed by the client for the building works to which the design relates under all relevant requirements. You should not start design work until the client knows what his duties are as client. Allocation of sufficient time and resources. If it was me and I was in an architectural practice or a design practice at all, I would be incorporating those requirements relating to clients in terms of my appointment letter. You must ensure that all designers cooperate with all other duty holders. You must liaise with the principal contractor and share any information relevant to planning, managing, monitoring the work and the coordination of building work and design work for the purpose of ensuring compliance with all relevant requirements. If requested, the principal designer must assist the client in providing information to other designers and contractors. This one, point 6, when the principal designer appointment ends, no later than 28 days after that end, you must give a document to the client explaining arrangements under duties 11M1 to 3, 11M1 to 5. Basically, it means the stuff that we've just talked about. This is what I would have done if I had been retained as principal designer throughout the entirety of the project. I no longer am. Here you go. So you mentioned about building control. Well, what you should do, and we'll come to notification of duty holders in a minute, but if you're no longer acting as principal designer, that document should be issued to the client and to the new principal contractor and the new principal designer, informing them, this is what I've done to date. And you know, as a structural engineer, I would use this to my advantage. If I'm completely honest, I would stipulate, here's the document, here's what I've designed relating to part A. I have not designed anything relating to part B, part C, part D. Whether that would stand up in court if you identify non-compliance relating to fire safety and something horrible happens, I'm not entirely sure. But I think it would be prudent to include those elements relating to what you've excluded from your design when your principal designer appointment comes to an end.
Yeah, that is where the problem lies, right? Because from what I'm hearing, not from myself, but also from other people, is because you're going to end up with you could end up with several principal designers on the job. You can end up with the engineer doing it, starting off, and then you can end the architect taking over, the quantity surveyor taking over.
If that's, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, if that's the case, you've breached the building regulations. Because there should only be one principal designer in place.
No, once at a time.
Yeah, of course, there could be, and bearing in mind throughout the lifespan of the project, there may well be 3 or 4, and each of those should issue a compliance declaration, yeah. And in that, we'll come to compliance declaration shortly, but all that really says is that you've acted in accordance with the building regulations in terms of Part 2A, and done all of the stuff that we've talked about. And I would struggle to see that a competent professional wouldn't be happy to say that you've communicated with all relevant duty holders, you've planned, managed and monitored, you've communicated to the client what their requirements are. I think that's a reasonable thing that professionals should be doing already before this legislation's come into force.
Yeah, I don't see a problem with that. It's this declaration at the end of the day when you've not been involved on the site and the client has not allocated another principal designer.
Yeah.
Right? And so you are then contacted by building control, which is what happened to me several times now, to sign off a declaration when all I've done is the structural work on it.
And I think that, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think it's important to note, we'll come to compliance declarations in a bit because I understand why many people have concerns, but it's important to note that this element, 28 days after the end, protects you as a principal designer. If you no longer can't feel like you can have an involvement in the project for whatever reason that is, you need to be clear about that and inform everybody and detail what you would have done if you've been retained as PD. And the compliance declaration details the dates of your appointment. So, principal contractor have exactly the same requirements. The only other thing that varies from that is this point here, number 1. So, person carrying out the work must cooperate with client designers to ensure, to the extent necessary to ensure the work is compliant with all relevant requirements. So it's important to note that principal contractors have to build in accordance with the building regulations, irrespective of what the design sets. Now, what I mean by that is a defence, I'll use a relatively infamous case, a structural engineer has designed something making the assumption that it's masonry construction, and it turns out it was timber frame. Contractor goes in, puts pad stones on top of cripple studs. Like, that is not acceptable. You should have, under these provisions, but even under any common sense provisions previously, I suppose, should have communicated with all relevant duty holders and then built in accordance with the building regulations themselves. It's important to note that contractor should be competent to identify works that should be completed in accordance with the building regulations. And that is why I think, again, principal contractors are accruing lots of responsibility and duties under these provisions. Principal designers are as well, but I think particularly for domestic clients, principal contractors have a huge amount of responsibility. Any questions on those two slides? Just
It's similar to the CDM regulation change, that it changed and pushed it onto the contractor.
The terminology, and again, I know nothing about CDM, I'll be completely honest, but my understanding is that the terminology, all reasonable steps, plan, manage and monitor, is very, very similar to that of the CDM regs, which has led to even more confusion by people saying, I'm not doing CDM, it's completely separate.
But just one other query. When we say appointment
Yep.
in there,
Yes.
does that have to be an express document from the client, as in CDM and in part of all work, or you have to have a written piece of paper to say you are appointed? Because it doesn't mention that, it just says appointment.
Well, yeah, so two things, split again, domestic client and client. Client must make the appointments under Regulation 11D, so they should be informing you as a client that you are the principal designer or principal contractor. Domestic client, no, if you're in charge of the control of the design phase of the project, you are by default. The appointment ends, there is no legal document that's been associated with the amendments to Part 2A, it's your interpretation of how you express to them that your appointment has come to an end. But it does say you must give a document to the client explaining arrangements under duties 11M 1 to 3 and M to 5. Basically, plan, manage and monitor, communicate to all relevant duty holders what I would have done if I had been retained as PD throughout the entirety of the project. So next bit, competence. We've not really talked about a huge amount, but under Section 35 of the Building Safety Act, amendments to the building regulations, which we've talked about, Part 2A is duties and competence. So it's important to note that there are a number of registers for principal contractors, the CIOB, principal designers, CIAT, and REBA have also provided registers. Really good book by REBA, which I've also read. I don't get any money if you buy these, by the way, but no, it's fine. I have read them, they're really, really good. And there's a couple of PAS documents, 8672 and 8671, about what competence in the built environment looks like. I would highly recommend the publicly available specifications, free to download, worth a read. So, next bit we're going to talk about is those points we talked about before. Notification of duty holders, commencement notice, compliance declaration. And what a compliance declaration means and what it doesn't mean. So, exactly the same transition arrangements. We're well past those now, but from the 1st of October 2023, these requirements kicked in. These are applicable to local authorities as well as private building control bodies. Within 14 days of your appointment, as PD or PC, you must provide a notice to the building control body, local authority or private, confirming that you are PD or PC. This little extract here is a piece of software that I developed for Al. And going back to your point there, what we've done, and it's not a sales pitch, but what we've done is that when you put your email or an email associated listing that this person is acting as PD, you get a notification that you've been listed as PD on this project. Because I think it's the right thing to do. It's not within the legislation, but I think it's the right thing to do, that you notify people if they are listed as PD or PC. Anyway, that's what we do. And you list name, organisation, all the sorts of things you would expect, address, etc., etc.
Do you have to do that as an architect? If you're doing, you don't even know if this project is going to go on site, and we're doing feasibility studies and things like that. I was going to mention it before when you mentioned about planning, but I think it's important to note this is about the building regulations and when in control of the design phase of the building work, design of building work. So building work defined under Regulation 3, planning, feasibility studies, all those sorts of things is not building work itself. So it's building regulations, construction phase. So alongside the bits that we've talked about, notification of duty holders and compliance declarations, they also, in their wisdom, made a change to the definition of commencement. So, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Just going back to what you just finished.
Yeah.
What you said about There being two separate sort of the design phase and the construction phase.
Yes.
But technically, before anything's been built,
Yeah.
so I get this form through, quite often, and I have to put down on there that I'm the principal designer.
Yep.
And who the principal contractor is going to be.
Yep.
But at that point, they haven't actually constructed anything, so technically, I'm still in on that form, because up until they actually knock a wall down or do any work, I'm still the principal. So when you say that this is a separate element, it's not, because up until actual work is, because this is a pre-commencement document, isn't it? To say work is going to happen. So at that point, I'm still the principal designer.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but it's worthwhile mentioning about the interaction with building control and the notices that you need to provide and what the building regulations say. I think it's important because you're talking about building control, asking for stuff and all that sort of stuff. Important to separate the two out. Compliance to the building regulations and notices to building control. Compliance to the building regulations says that appointments must be made, both PD and PC, before the construction phase begins. That's it. Now, in terms of notification to building control bodies, both private and local authority, the requirement is that you notify them within 14 days of your appointment. That's it. So if you know that the principal contractor has been appointed, or has been appointed, for even if he hasn't started work on site, then he is appointed and therefore he is the principal contractor.
You may not know.
You may not...
Because I mean, we've got a scheme where we're going for building control.
Yeah.
And get a complete set of plans,
Mm-hmm.
which will then be costed by a couple of contractors.
Yes.
But until such a time as those figures are back,
Of course.
they're signing a contract.
Yeah, of course, and you won't know until the construction phase. That's the point. So the appointments must be made before the construction phase begins. And as long as you notify the registered building control approver or the local authority 14 days after their appointment, then that's completely fine.
I think there's a bit of an issue with the word appointment, because obviously as
Yeah.
architects, we're appointed.
Correct.
Could be 3-4 years.
Yeah, so again, they didn't help with the terminology. I think it's
the appointment
for the purposes of the bit. Yeah, and the only way we can kind of square that circle is just highlighting again that it's design work for the purposes of the building regulations, design work for building work regulation free, not anything to do with planning or pre-assessment.
Because our appointment might be finished, and then some time passes, the client goes and gets the
Yep.
contractor, we don't even know who the contractor is, because we're no longer involved,
Yes.
so we're not going to be notified.
No, of course, but again, it's not your responsibility to notify regarding a principal contractor. The principal contractor should be notifying the building control body of his appointment.
It's like a hot potato, no one wants saying on to it, do they?
I didn't write it. So, where did we get to? Right, commencement notice. So yeah, in their wisdom, they changed the definition of commencement. So there was previously no legal definition of commencement. We used to think about it for various elements. So now there are two distinct elements. There's starting works, which is what we would all understand. Digging a trench, pouring some concrete, putting a steel beam in. That is starting works. And that goes back to section 47 of the Building Act, can't submit an initial notice, yada, yada, yada. Commencement now is much, much, much further down the piece. So commencement now has three types. There's complex, which is public buildings of more than 100 people or more than 2 basements. There's non-complex, which is basically, without being too legally terminology, it's the change of a footprint. And then there's other, and for other, you need to inform the building control body. So we're talking about loft conversions, garage conversions, those sorts of things. Material change of use, if there's no change of footprint. You need to inform the building control body what 15% of the works would be, and that goes on the application that you put in for the building control body. So complex and non-complex. Commencement now is when the lowest, most ground floor structure is complete. So if we're talking about an extension or a new dwelling, commencement is when you've put the block and beam in, the oversight in is concreted, that is now commencement. Now, for a garage conversion, a loft conversion, when there's no change of footprint, commencement is when you have reached that 15%, which you've already told us what that is. So, for example, a garage conversion would be 15% of installation complete. A loft conversion would be structure complete, for example. Material change of use, barn conversion would be, I don't know, raft complete, for example. That's what commencement is.
Yeah, but under that, surely they normally come down to see the ground for the foundations.
Yes, so commencement is not an inspection. It is a notice that the person who carries out the work provides to the building control body. It's not an inspection at all.
We've been asked to put this date for the 15%.
Yeah.
But it was, I wouldn't classify it as other building works because it was on the outbuilding, new outbuilding.
Right.
And I still had to assess what's the 50%.
No, you shouldn't do. So it would be that would be non-complex because it's a new footprint, so to speak.
Okay.
So there we go. That's commencement. And the reason why they did it in actuality was there were house builders that would have a set of 50 units. They put a bit of drainage in for one unit and then they would lock in the building regulations, and that's why we would have instances of 2 or 3 years later when they were still building to older regulations. So with the changes to uplifts to Part F and L, the concern was that they would continue to build over the previous standards, and this is on a plot by plot basis, and that means they need to reach a later stage, basically. That's the reason for it. And that's kind of what we look at in terms, again, this is what I produced. This is our form, which sets out, and we sent it out complex, as I said, non-complex, and the estimated data commencement. So, compliance declarations, as we've talked about a few instances. So, Regulation 18 of the RBCA regs, and Regulation 16 of the building regulations, so it relates to local authorities as well. And what it says, as the principal designer for the work, I can confirm that I fulfilled the duties as principal designer or sole designer under Part 2A, duties and competence of the principal regulations, the building regulations themselves. And then you can put a date of when you were principal designer. Now, it's important to note, as we've talked about before, that you are not stipulating that the entirety of the works is built in accordance with building regulations. That lies with the principal contractor because they have a responsibility to build in accordance with the building regulations under Part 2A, not just to follow the design blindly. So that's really important to note as a principal designer. It is also important to note that under 11A1 for a domestic client, the overarching responsibility lies with the principal contractor to plan, manage and monitor to ensure compliance to all relevant requirements, allocated sufficient time and resources. So all of those things are pushing responsibility towards the principal contractor. But as principal designer, you are required under Regulation 18 to issue a compliance declaration for the time periods that you acted as PD. And any building control body should not at least issue a final certificate or a completion certificate unless they have received those compliance declarations from the PD or PC, because it says in the final certificate, I, OWL, hereby confirms it has received a statement from the client for the work described in the final certificate in accordance with 18D, and we confirm that we've received a statement from each principal contractor for the work and from each principal contractor for the work described in this final certificate, which is in accordance with 18C. So on our final certificate, it says that we've received those statements. So as co-owner and director of OWL, I would be issuing knowingly a falsified document, which I'm not going to do. So that's why we need them. Any questions on compliance declarations at all? Yes, go ahead.
It's going to sound really, really picky, but let's say for the sake of argument, the contractor starts work.
Yes.
And builds it to the letter of your drawings.
Yes.
And they never change a thing.
Yes.
Literally every
Never had it, but yes.
But at the end,
yes.
Would that then mean that you were technically still the principal designer? Because if they're supposed to take that role on, if they design something,
yep.
Does that then?
I think it's really important. There's bits of conflict in regulation, not conflicting, but supplementary regulations that all kind of kick in.
I guess really, because what I'm saying is, how do you put, like, at the end?
Yes.
Let's say, for the sake of argument, they get to the end.
Yep.
And there's no way for you to prove that they made any changes.
Yeah.
You know, I specified seller text, they use Kingspan.
Yeah.
You know, there's no way to prove whatever that element was.
Yes.
Then they say, well, actually, I'm not signing. I'm no longer. No, I'm not the principal designer. You are.
Yeah.
Which contractors are going to say that.
Yeah.
Because they don't want it. How do you?
Well, I think. Yeah, well, I think it's important that you have those conversations up front and you detail who is acting as PD or PC throughout the entirety of the project. Now, in terms of what you're talking about, replacing of products and similar and altering things, yeah, it's important to note that if you undertake any design work, you have a responsibility to be competent for that work and to undertake it in accordance with the building regulations. So, and any person under your instruction to do so. So to use an example, one maybe the structural engineers are concerned about. Structural engineer, you design a package, all looks fine, you resign as PD, contractor takes over, brilliant, he goes off, he says, that beam's far too big, I'm going to go and speak to my mate Bob, who's going to design something, job's a good one, and it fails or whatever. Now, firstly, the principal contractor had an overall responsibility to allocate sufficient time, resources, yada, 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 to build in accordance with the building regulations. Principal contractor had a responsibility to build in accordance with building regulations, not only that. But secondly, he is also a designer because he's instructed another structural engineer to undertake that design work. Designers have responsibilities to be competent and to undertake their duties in accordance with the building regulations. It's just that a principal designer and principal contractor have to issue the compliance declarations at the end. So alterations that are made on site on the hoof are still design work, and therefore the responsibility allocated to that would default, in the event of something going wrong, in the event of a claim, back to the person who undertook that decision. You know, using your example, if in 10 years' time you have to open up some walls because of damp or mould or whatever, and you find a completely different specified insulation, and there's scampering rounds for liability, but you've designed something in accordance with the relevant building regulations, then the design decision has been taken by the person who undertook it and put that different insulation in place. There's another element regarding visiting sites, which I think is an important one. Now, there's nothing within the regulations that say that you should visit sites as a principal designer at all. It doesn't say that. It says that you should plan, manage and monitor and communicate with all relevant duty holders and take all reasonable steps to comply. So if you are PD as retained as PD throughout the entirety of the project, I think you need to assess and record the number of site inspections, none to 10, however many you think is reasonable, to meet your legal requirements under 11M. I think that's important that you record that information. Part of the stuff that you're doing is recording and justifying the decisions that you are making.
You said earlier that we're not signing that the work has been done in compliance.
No, but so what I'm trying to say there is that many architects like yourself may well get concerned that the works that have been... Questions are often raised regarding how many times do I need to visit a site for a domestic property or whatever. And the range can be anywhere between none whatsoever to however many, 20, for example. But I think it's important that if you are being retained as PD throughout the entirety of the project, and, for example, then you have a responsibility to plan, manage and monitor and communicate with all relevant duty holders to take reasonable steps that the works comply to the building regulations. Now, are you doing that by not visiting site and not inspecting the works? Potentially, if you have a competent contractor that you've worked with for God knows how long, and that you know the quality of their work, and that they've confirmed that they've not varied from the specification, structural engineers visited site, he's happy, etc., etc. But I think it's important that you record why, if you are retained as PD during the construction phase of the project.
Well, I have no control over who the PC is.
Yeah.
So I will be appointed to do my design.
Yes.
I will then work with other designers, so I'll work with engineers,
Yes.
and I'll carry out my duties as principal designer to coordinate and make sure that
Yes.
I will submit building regulation application.
Yes.
I will get the approval.
Yes.
That's
And
that's handed over to the client.
And
I don't offer contract administration.
No, then
I don't plan any.
at that stage, if you're resigning as PD before the construction phase begins, then you should be informing everybody with that document.
Clients are asking if I can then be retained as
PD.
PD
Yes.
without. I mean, all I can offer because I don't offer contract administration, is I say, well, look, if there are any design queries throughout the contract,
Yep.
and you need me to come on site to go through that, I will do that.
And I think that's
But
really,
I can't be, I mean, if they do that without my knowledge.
I think that's really important because again, it's about being honest and open with what your role is at each and every stage. If you need to resign as PD when you submitted the building control application and you want to resign at that point, irrespective of what happens, what you can say is, I'm resigning as PD, but I would like, if you need me, I can be retained as a designer to answer specific queries. Builder says, what do I do on X element? You say, fine, yes, this is what you should do. By the way, you're still PD, I'm not taking on that role. It's really important that everybody is clear who is PD and who is PC at every stage of the project. Because if you're resigning as PD before the construction phase begins, fair enough, you've got no obligation and could never ever be indicated that you would need to visit site during the construction phase because you're no longer PD, you're a designer. However, if you're retained throughout the entirety of the project, you have a responsibility to plan, manage and monitor, communicate with all relevant duty holders, take reasonable steps.
The problem is clients don't understand that. So if you resign as principal designer, you don't get any more work.
True. Well, the only thing I would say, I understand the issue, but the 11K, which we talked about before, is you should not start design work until the client understands their duties.
Yeah, I think I can see what you're saying actually, but I think maybe your form there, say the principal designer, for this element of the work can...
Yeah, so I didn't write the legislation.
No, I'm thinking on your form...
So yeah, but my form reflects Regulation 18 of the RBCA regs. So all I have done is put it in a format which means that you can sign it.
Well, when you look at 11.2 then the bottom there, it says, from each principal designer.
Yep.
That seems to assume there are several principal designers.
From each...
Yeah, for the lifespan of the project. So you can quite easily see that, I mean, like I can see what your form is saying. I would tell them.
So bearing in mind that upon the appointment of a new principal designer and principal contractor, the building control body should be notified within 14 days. If we're notified, then we know there's another principal contractor under Regulation 17. So if we're notified of a new principal contractor, we'll ask for a new compliance declaration from that person that we've been notified about at the end of the project.
I hope it works that way. And not the feedback I'm getting is it's not working.
Well, it's important to note I didn't write it, but
I understand, but basically we've got to be telling the client
yes.
a lot more
yes.
when we take on the bill. We're going to have
Correct.
to give them an A4 script and say,
yes.
this is the Building Safety Act, right? Here are all the roles, right? This is what I'm going to do for you,
yes.
right? And when that bit is done, I'm going to be the principal designer, and you must appoint someone else, or the principal contractor's going to take on that role and put it out in black and white to it.
Correct.
And it's difficult to do this because the industry is not.
It is difficult to do. It's this.
Telling the clients, listen.
It's
difficult.
This is difficult, and it's supposed to be difficult because it's a cultural change for the biggest change in construction regulations since the Second World War. So anyone who's expecting it not to be difficult is probably not getting the idea. And the reason why it's come in is, again, 2017, biggest loss of life since the Second World War in a single event. This is the reason why. That's what we're looking at, delineation of responsibility.
We're also going to have to issue a letter to give to the client, to give to their builder, to tell them, because I can tell you now virtually every builder I know, right, doesn't even know this exists.
And I was chatting to a couple of people during the breaks, and I think, and as I've said before, principal contractors are those that are most at risk, have the most responsibility of these requirements, and they're also, anecdotally, the ones that are least engaging with these requirements.
What happens to the projects which, with the clients who've been with us before 1st of October 2024? Obviously, we couldn't inform them of any of that because that didn't exist. So, now suddenly it's an added thing.
Yeah, so
the client wants to pay for extra things.
No, we don't. But again,
getting onto the building site.
But then they're not in accordance with 11A1, which is allocating sufficient time and resources. The point being is, the transition arrangements were in place, which are an initial notice submitted before full plans application before the 1st of October, and then you had 6 months to start the works. And if you're not, then you're subject to these requirements. And I think it's important, again, you're honest with clients and have these difficult conversations about what their responsibilities and duties are. How are we doing for time? Sorry, I feel like I'm rambling on.
Yeah, you're okay.
Yeah, of course.
Quick question, sorry.
No, you're right.
Paragraphs 10 to 11 to stated there.
Yep.
Should they be on the completion certificates issued now or from 2024? Is that correct?
Yeah, so this is extracted from the RBCA Regs Schedule 1, Form 5, which is the final certificate. So any private building control body which issues a final certificate will have these statements.
From 2024 onwards.
From the 1st of October, any application after the 1st of October 2023. Again, and I think, from a general practice surveying point of view, if you've got the final certificate, it says that they've received the compliance declarations. I think it's reasonable to ask for those compliance declarations as well, if you're completing your due diligence for your clients. Yes?
Sorry,
No, you're right.
I'm
No. Perfect.
If there's any kind of crossover, I might have missed something here, but let's say for the sake of argument, a contractor started work and they've put in, we're the principal designer, they're the principal contractor,
Yeah.
and then halfway through the build,
Yeah.
something changes, the partition walls need to be moved or whatever, so we have to do some more drawing.
Yes.
But something has changed along the way. Let's say the foundations.
Yep.
I've shown it at a metre.
Yep.
They've dug it down to 1.2.
Yep.
How does that work with the principal designer part?
I think it's, again, sorry to bang on about it, but it's really important that you detail who PD and who PC is at any one point in the project, because who undertakes that role will be determined who PD is and who PC is, and in the event of something going wrong, who will be presumably liable for that instance. So in all of the instances, design, as we've alluded to, design is not just putting pen to paper, it's digging in an extra 200 millimetres, but that is design. And if they do that, then as a designer, they should be competent to do so, and if they aren't competent, or they cease to be competent, then they should stop doing it, basically.
I mean, sadly, I understand you didn't write the legislation. I think we all know that, but I don't think this works. It almost doesn't work for small clients.
No, I think
it's terrible. It's such a burden on small, garage conversion.
I completely agree. It's quite difficult as a building control body to explain to Mrs. Miggins about their garage conversion, the need for a commencement notice to say they're not going to lapse in 3 years, and a compliance declaration, and that they should issue one themselves. Bearing in mind that we need one from the client as well as the principal designer and principal contractor. But as I keep on saying, we're servants of the law, so that's what I have no opinion. I'm completely opinionless. So they write the legislation, we must follow it. Anyway, so moving on. Little bit about building control going forward. So registered building control approvers. It wasn't just a name change. We are now subject to a whole suite of documents known as the Operation Standard Rules about how we should follow and what we should do. And it's actually the first time ever that local authorities are subject to the same requirements as private building control bodies are, and the same regulator. There is a changing nature of building control, which I think I've picked up on a number of conversations that we've had. It's important to note that we submit information to the BSR as our regulator about a number of things that we do. So we report back about initial notices submitted, cancellations, all these sorts of things that we then submit to the BSR, and the local authorities also have to submit this information under the Operation Standard Rules, key performance indicators. Registered building inspectors. So prior to the 6th of April 2024, building control professionals were a menagerie, I suppose, of different chartered bodies and previous experience and all those sorts of things. And the architects in the room will know that architects are a restricted title. You can't just go off and call yourself an architect. You need to go through that process and have a registered body and similar. With building inspectors, they've got one step further. So we have restricted activities and functions, which means that you cannot undertake plan checking for the purposes of building control or site inspections for the purposes of building control unless you are registered with the BSR at that competence level which is suitable for the project itself. It is a criminal offence if you do so. So the sum of all of that, I suppose, is that a number of people within the building control profession left the profession because they did not want to go through the competency assessment. So there were 3 competency assessments with Chartered Association of Building Engineers, BCCA, Building Control Competency Assessment, the BSCF, which was the local authority route. I actually completed a number of assessments for other RBIs going through the BCCA route. And in essence, what you get assessed against is this wagon wheel. So from the BICOF, Building Inspector Competency Framework, and so it's not an easy thing, which is why many people left, I think. So I had to produce a document. Mine was about 400 pages or so, and then you have an interview, which lasted an hour and a half, 2 hours, on each of these 9 sections of the BICOF itself. There's also a publicly available register, so if I was engaging with a building control body, the first thing that I would do would be go registered building inspectors in England, type in the building control body and see how many registered building inspectors they have. Because if they don't have very many, then they're unlikely to be able to service the project that you're looking at. At the end of all of that, you ended up with a registration, and as I said, your registration was determined by the type of work, which was determined by the purpose group, and the height of it. So myself, I am a Class 2 A, B and D registered building inspector and a Class 4 technical manager. Class H are the only ones that can work and look after the building control functions for HRBs. So to give an indication of those numbers, last time I looked, there's actually still more professional footballers in England and Wales than there are registered building inspectors. So roll on £300,000 a week. But in terms of Class 2s, there's somewhere around 2,750. In terms of Class 3s, there's around about 600. And in terms of Class 1s, there's about 1,000, 1,500 or so. Class 1s must work under supervision. Legally, they are not permitted to work unsupervised. So if a Class 1 is working under supervision, the legally responsible registered building inspector is the person who is supervising their work, i.e. plan check, site inspection, etc., etc. So changing nature of building control. So this is Part 2, Regulation 3 of the RBCA regs. Basically it says that approvers must not have any professional or financial interest in the works that we supervise. And I suppose I was just trying to highlight the nature of how things have changed a little bit. I think it's reasonable to say that prior to 2017, we'll use Grenfell as an example, prior to that date, it was not unheard of that a building control professional would go out and say, if you do X, Y, and Z, it'll be fine, basically. You know, dig over there, dig to this depth, all is well. However, that has changed. And part of that is the registration of the profession. So we're now at the same level, I suppose, and if you want to term it like that, as solicitors, vets, surgeons, etc. So this was the sick air guidance in summer 2023, so some time ago. And what it says is that prime compliance responsibilities, i.e. client, designers and builders, will be made very clear with the introduction of statutory duty holder roles, which they have. And there's the much stronger and more efficiently implemented formal enforcement system, which we're talking about, Section 35 and Section 36. This was the Grenfell Tower Phase 2 reports that came out in September 2024. And it's worthwhile just reading 113.35. So the evidence shows that in the period leading up to the Grenfell Tower fire, many of those involved in major construction projects, including clients, contractors, and even architects, regarded building control primarily as a source of advice and assistance. It was even described as an extension of the design team. In many cases, that was how building control itself saw its role. This was a serious misunderstanding that was fostered by building control bodies themselves, who preferred to cooperate with applicants to enable proposals to be approved rather than enforce the building regulations rigorously. In our view, that has to change. And the government has taken on and accepted that recommendation from Grenfell Tower Phase 2. So this was some ICC, the Industry Competency Committee, guidance for RBIs, which was produced in October 2024, where it provided the guidance relating to how an RBI should act, and I've extracted this one, there was like 5 different examples, for foundations excavated in clay soil. The RBI explains that they do not believe the foundations to be suitable for the situation and why they have come to that conclusion. The duty holder has asked what the RBI wants to see. The RBI responds by advising the duty holder should present a compliant excavation. They may point the duty holder towards areas of guidance or guidance on where compliance can be found. The point being, it is not a role of a registered building inspector to design elements for you. And that is very much interlinked into those compliance declarations, because at the end of the project, you are going to have to issue a compliance declaration to say you've designed and built in accordance with building regulations. There is no caveat to say John told me to do this. It doesn't work like that. You are issuing a legal notice to say the works comply. And therefore, it's important to note the responsibility and where it lies. And that's to design and build in accordance with building regulations lies with those who are carrying out the works. In terms of building control, again, very much a moving feast. So membership of the Building Control Independent Panel, so they have been appointed. Dame Judith Hackett, who published the report in 2018, Building a Safer Future, has also now been appointed to review the role of building control and assess the conflict of interest, or at least the perceived conflict of interest within the building control profession, how it operates in England and Wales. And they produced their terms of reference on Monday. And what it says, these 7 components, must ensure the building control workforce is competent, addressing concerns about local authority building control bodies, registered building control approvers and competent person schemes, opportunities for reform of the building regulations, and considering the relationship between building control and warranty schemes and whether intervention or reform is needed. So, the only thing I would say is building control is very, very likely to change again in the future. We've had a huge, vast amount of change within construction, particularly within building control, where we changed massively as a profession. I'm actually going to meet with Dame Judith Hackett as part of my role on a panel in the not too distant future. But I think it's highly likely that the role of building control bodies will be significantly reformed again in the future. I do not know what it will look like, but it will be different. And so we refer back to that point which I said before. So does a building control final certificate prove compliance with the building regulations? No, it doesn't. This is extracted from the final certificate that we issue in Form 5 of Schedule 1 of the Registered Building Control Approval Regulations. This certificate is evidence, but not conclusive evidence that the requirements specified in it have been complied with. That paragraph at the top there is actually in the Manual to the Building Regulations, which was produced in 2015. So this has always been the case. And what it says is receiving a completion certificate or final certificate is not a complete guarantee of compliance with the building regulations. The legal meaning is evidence but not conclusive evidence. The building control officer will not have checked every piece of building material and how it's been fitted or every aspect of submitted documents. It's the responsibility of those building work to comply with the building regulations. For example, a building has just received the final certificate or completion certificate, but the roof is leaking. The fact that the roof leaks is the builder's or designer's problem and not the building control body's problem. However, the building control body may point out problems either with the design or construction at any stage up to granting the final or completion certificate. So that is the legal status of registered building inspectors, building control bodies. It's really important to note that we, as a building control body, have no financial liability associated with defective premises and works. And that's really important. And the reason for that is that if we are applying regulations and ensuring that enforcement takes place, we cannot be in a conflict of interest situation where that enforcement would result in financial implications on a building control body. That is why there's no financial responsibility, and I think it's vitally important. Yes, of course.
It hasn't changed.
Of course.
Because it ends v. Murphy.
Murphy versus
Authority basically.
Murphy versus Brentwood, 1991. Yeah.
They walked away.
So the point being is that the amendments to Part 2A of the Building Regulations, Building Safety Act and roles and responsibility, I think what actually is done, at least in terms of the Building Regulations, is it is highlighted and clarified and crystallised something that everyone should have known. which is if you design something and it goes wrong, you're responsible. If you build something and it goes wrong, you're responsible. Saying that a building control body is issued a final certificate is not an excuse that in the event of something going wrong in the not too distant future. Any questions for me? Yes, sorry, sir.
Just a minor one. I
Yeah.
recently had a final certificate from a local authority.
Yeah.
It's got to be signed within 5 days.
The completion certificate from the local authority. I'm going to have to read, my apologies, I will come to you short afterwards, after the meeting, because I'm going to have to reread. I haven't looked at completion certificate for a little while because I don't work for local authorities. I'm going to reread that and I'll come back to you. I will come and have a look. Is that okay?
Yeah.
We'll finish up and then I'll come over.
Yeah.
Sorry.
To what extent do you check like structural design calculations? I mean, in our sort of preamble, we say advise clients to get a full plans application and get everything agreed before they start the work. But I'm not sure if you even look at the calculations.
Well, so as a building, our roles, so I'll allude to private building control body and then I'll talk about full plans application again, as I've alluded to before. So what we do, and it says in the final certificate that we issue, that we've acted in accordance with Regulation 4, which is the functions of approvers. And functions approvers basically says, we, OWL, have acted with all professional skill and judgment to ascertain whether we think the works comply to all relevant requirements. That's what it says. Now, professional skill and judgment, bearing in mind that every single person who is registered as a building inspector has gone through a competency assessment and has to re-register every 4 years and to complete things in between. I can only say from our internal procedures, we check structural engineers' design, we review structural engineers' calculations. If they come from our internal policy, which I produced, if they come from an engineer that's not chartered, or a member of the Institute of Structural Engineers, or a member of the Institute of Civil Engineers, we go and get those calculations verified and checked by our checking engineer. That is our process.
And when you've done that, do you tell the client or the applicant?
Well, we would...
Do you say at some stage, yes, the calculations are approved?
Well, again, so the proof point is the wrong terminology that you're looking at. Because again, what is it? It's evidence, but not conclusive evidence. Where does responsibility lie? With the structural engineer who designed it and produced the calculations. Registered building control approvers, although it says approvers, is not very good terminology. We do not approve singular elements. What we do is we act within our professional skill and judgment within the period that the initial notice is valid, and then we issue a final certificate at the end when we've retrieved all information, compliance declarations, all the rest of it, so that we can ascertain the works completed and ascertain whether the works comply. We issue design reviews. We issue design reviews when we receive information. I'm pretty proud of our timescales that we do on that, but we issue design reviews when information comes in and we provide updated design reviews.
But when you've done reviewed the design, do you actually tell the client or the applicant, yes, we've reviewed the design and there's no comments?
So the way I would look at information that's provided to us is an audit, and this is both design work and works that are being completed on site. What we do as building control bodies, both local authority and private, is we audit Office of Compliance and we make comments regarding where we determine and identify non-compliances. That's what we do.
I think what the gentleman's trying to say, to private, is if you put it into a local authority for a full plans check, you get a certificate back to say...
And that's the point I was trying to make in terms of the differences between a full plans application and a building notice. A full plans application is a legal application under Regulation 13, I think. And at the end of that, then they would produce a document that says, we have assessed these drawings and determined the works comply. And the actual legal basis of that is exactly the same as what I've talked about here. We've assessed it. Its evidence is not conclusive evidence. The legal status has always been the same. Full plans, building notice, initial notice. Responsibility still lies with the people carrying out the work.
So you don't do a full plans as such?
No, because we can't legally. So there's two different types of application for local authority, building notice and full plans. When you apply to any private building control body, all they can do is submit, I say all, what they do is submit an initial notice. We do not have a full plans or building notice type application. It's just an initial notice. Any other questions or queries for me? Sorry. Brilliant. I do have some more questions for you guys to answer, but I think, to be honest, last thing, it's a bit hot, it's a bit humid. If I'll put them up. If anyone wants to answer them, that's completely fine, but I'm completely exhausted and wrapped up. Where's JJ? Has he vanished? Perfect. Well, I'll tell you what, we'll leave him up for a second. I'll grab JJ and then we'll finish up 2 seconds.